The stars were a lie. For generations, humans had looked up at them with wonder. They told stories of adventure and hope. They dreamed of meeting those who lived out there. They sent messages of peace. They never got an answer. The Galactic Coalition had watched the blue-green world for a long time. They saw the humans fight each other. They saw them burn their own forests and poison their own seas. They saw their potential for violence. The file on humanity was labeled developing, emotionally volatile, resource-rich. A decision was made. It was not a decision of war. It was a decision of gardening. You do not fight a weed. You simply make the ground unfit for it to grow. The plan was called Project Gentle Garden. It was clean. It was quiet. It was, the coalition believed, kind. First contact was not a shining ship landing in a field. It was a subtle shift in the orbits of small, icy bodies in the outer solar system. Gently, over years, their paths were altered. They began a long fall toward the sun, passing close to Earth. The effect was slow. The gravity of these passing objects stressed the planet's crust. Deep beneath the oceans and continents, tectonic plates groaned and slipped. Earthquakes of unheard-of strength shattered cities not built to withstand them. The city of Lima was the first to vanish into a new crack in the world. Then Jakarta sank beneath a raging sea. Next came the nanites. Tiny machines, smaller than dust, were released into the upper atmosphere. They drifted down, invisible. Their task was simple: disrupt. They found their way into cloud-seeding nuclei, twisting weather patterns. They infiltrated soil, altering its chemistry just enough to kill specific crops. Where there was rain, there were now floods that lasted for years. Where there was sun, the ground cracked into dust. The great breadbaskets of the world, the American plains, the Ukrainian fields, the Argentine pampas, turned to barren land. Famine walked the earth not as a sudden guest, but as a permanent resident. The humans called it the silencing, the slow death of their world. They blamed themselves. They thought it was the final price for their old mistakes. They fought over the last scraps of food and fresh water. Governments fell. Networks of light and information, the internet, the power grids, flickered and went dark. One by one. In what was once Busan, South Korea, 2 people survived in a deep underground shelter. The shelter was built long ago for a different fear. Now it was a tomb holding life. Gene was once an engineer. He liked to fix things, to understand how they worked. Now, he spent his days trying to keep the air scrubbers running and the ancient geothermal generator humming. His hands, which used to build delicate circuit boards, were now rough and stained with oil and dirt. Mira was a biologist. She had studied life. Now, she managed a desperate farm under harsh artificial lights, growing bitter algae and tough fungi. It was not enough, but it was what they had. She was practical, her hope worn thin but not broken. They were not alone. There were 300 others in the Busan haven. Tae, a quiet, strong man who had been a logistics manager for a shipping company, now kept careful track of their few supplies. Sumin, a former nurse, tended to the sick and the weary. Life was a cycle of gray routines. Wake up, check the systems, eat the small daily ration, work, sleep, repeat. The children, born underground, had pale skin and asked about the outside sky, as if it were a fairy tale. One day, Jean was on the surface with the scavenging team. They wore patched suits and filtered masks. The world above was a nightmare of twisted metal and concrete, all coated in a layer of gray mud. The air tasted of acid and decay. As they picked through the ruins of an old factory, looking for usable metal, the sky did something strange. It shimmered. High up, where the clouds should be, the air wavered like a heat haze. Then, for just a second, Jean saw it. A shape, vast, smooth, and impossible, like a sliver of obsidian. It was there, and then it was gone, hidden again. Did you see that? He whispered into his mask radio. See what? Tae's voice crackled back. The smog. Jean didn't answer. He stared at the empty, sickly sky. He had seen something that did not belong. A cold feeling, different from the familiar despair, settled in his stomach. It was the feeling of being watched. That night, deep underground, he told Mira. They sat in their small shared room, the only light from a dim LED strip. "My eyes are tired, Jean," Mira said, not unkindly. "The mind plays tricks when you are hungry and tired." "It wasn't a trick," Jean said, his voice low. "It was real. It was made. It was not from here." Mira looked at him, her practical mind turning over the idea. A made thing in the sky. An unnatural thing in a world dying of what seemed like natural causes. She did not believe him, not fully. But she saw the certainty in his eyes, a spark she hadn't seen in years. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's say it was real. What was it doing?" Jean looked at the cold concrete ceiling, as if he could see through it to the sky beyond. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it wasn't helping." The silence in the room was heavy. It was the same silence that had covered the world. But now, for Jean, it had a new quality. It was no longer just the silence of death. It was the silence of a predator, holding its breath. The memory of the shape in the sky did not leave Jean. It lived in the back of his mind like a thorn. He started looking at their broken world with new eyes. The earthquakes that always seemed to hit the biggest population centers. The famines that targeted the most fertile lands with perfect cruelty. The storms that hunted like they had a mind. It felt less like nature and more like a pattern. He began to spend his free time in the Haven's old data archive. It was a sad collection of failing hard drives and water-damaged books. Most people saw it as a graveyard for a dead world. Jean started digging. He looked for reports from the time of the silencing, from before the networks died. Weather satellite anomalies. Seismic reports that didn't make sense. He found fragments. A scientist in Chile reporting impossible atmospheric refraction before the great coastal wave hit. A geologist in Turkey noting simultaneous deep earth resonance on opposite sides of the planet. Single pieces of a puzzle no one knew existed. Mira watched him. She saw the change. The hollow look of grief in his eyes was slowly replaced by a hard, focused light. It worried her. False hope could be more dangerous than despair down here. "You are chasing a ghost, Jean?" she said one evening as he squinted at a blurry image on a cracked screen. "Even if you are right, what then? What can we do about it?" "We can know," Jean said, his voice quiet but firm. "If we were murdered, we should know. We owe that to everyone who is gone." Mira had no answer to that. She simply put a hand on his shoulder and left him to his search. The break came from far away. A message crackled over the Haven's old long-range radio, a device few even remembered how to use. It was from a small survivor group in the Siberian tundra, calling themselves the Frostwatch. Their signal was weak, breaking apart. "Object fell from the sky. Not rock metal, we see symbols. It is not ours." Then static. Jean was already moving. He found Tay. "We need to go there. Now." Tay, ever calm, simply asked, "Why?" "Siberia is thousands of kilometers away. The journey would take months. We would likely die." "Because they found something that fell," Jean said, his eyes burning. "Something that is not from here. The answer is there. I feel it." To Jin's surprise, Mira spoke up. "He is right." She had been listening. "We are dying slowly here. This is a question that needs an answer. I will go with him." In the end, a team of 5 was formed. Jean, Mira, Tay, and 2 others. A skilled mechanic named Day and a former park ranger named Hannah who knew how to survive in the wild. They took one of the Haven's few working ground vehicles, a heavy, treaded transport fueled by fermented algae biodiesel. It was slow and loud. They packed what little they could spare: tools, filters, rations, and weapons for hunting. The journey was a trip through a graveyard. They saw no other living humans. They saw bones of cities being swallowed by forests or deserts. They crossed great rivers that were now toxic trickles. They drove through silent, empty lands where the only sound was the wind. It deepened their silence, weighed them down. After 3 months of hard travel, they found the Frostwatch. They were living in the bones of an old Arctic research station. The people were thin and tough, their faces lined by the cold wind. Their leader, an old woman named Yuna, led them to a crater in the ice. It was not a normal impact crater. It was too neat, too smooth. And in the center, half buried in the permafrost, was a ship. It was small, maybe the size of a bus. It was shaped like a teardrop, made of a material that was black but seemed to drink the weak sunlight. One side was torn open, ripped apart by the heat of its crash. Around it, the snow and ice were stained with fluids that were the wrong color, vibrant purples and acidic greens. "It has been here for 2 moons, Yuna said. "We looked inside. There are beings. Or there were. They are dead. And there are machines that still glow." Jean approached, his heart pounding in his ears. He climbed up the torn metal and looked inside. The interior was a mess of shattered crystal panels and twisted metal. 2 figures were strapped into chairs. They were slender, with gray skin and large, black eyes now dull in death. They wore sleek suits. Aliens. The word felt too small, too much from an old movie. This was real. It was horrifying and amazing. And in the front of the cabin, a flat crystal panel, cracked but still glowing with soft blue light. Symbols moved across it, curves and dots that were clearly a language. "Day, the tools," Jean said, his voice a whisper. Working carefully, they managed to disconnect the crystal panel and power cell. They carried it back to the research station. For days, Jean and Mira worked, trying to understand. The symbols were a code, but the system itself, it had patterns, visual logs, navigation data. They found a way to make it play the last recorded visual log. The image flickered to life in the dark room of the station. It showed a view of space. And there, hanging in the blackness, was Earth. Beautiful, blue, whole. The log's timestamp was from 50 years ago. At the very start of the silencing, a calm, smooth voice spoke in a language of clicks and tones. Subtitles in the same alien symbols appeared. But the system had a translation matrix. Slowly, letter by letter, English words formed beneath the symbols. Project Gentle Garden. Phase 1 Initiation. Subject 8897. Humanity. Planetary destabilization parameters are set. Tectonic agitation via Kuiper Belt object redirection. Active. Climatic recalibration via atmospheric nanites. Active. Expected time to total sociocultural collapse. 10 to 12 solar cycles. Goal. Resource reclamation and pacification with minimal fleet footprint. Note. Species shows low resilience. No meaningful counteraction expected. The screen changed. It showed a schematic of Earth with pulsating lines targeting the Ring of Fire, the breadbaskets, the great river deltas. It was a map of their murder and the cold, dark room. No one made a sound. The only noise was the hum of the alien power cell and the howl of the Siberian wind outside. Jean looked at Mira. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terrible understanding. The grief, the struggle, the decades of slow death. It was not an accident. It was a project. A garden. Tay put a hand on the wall to steady himself. Day was crying silent tears of rage. Hannah just stared, her jaw tight. Jean turned back to the screen. The cold feeling in his stomach was gone, replaced by a fire so vast and so quiet it scared him. He looked at the dead Earth on the screen, and then at the symbols labeling his people as Subject 8897. "Okay," Jean said, his voice utterly calm in the frozen silence. "Now we know." The return journey to Busan Haven was made in a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of a pot coming to a boil with the lid clamped shut. The 5 of them sat in the transport, the alien data crystal wrapped carefully and hidden. They did not speak much. They looked at the dead world passing by their windows, and now they saw a crime scene. When they finally reached the underground shelter, they called a meeting of the Haven Council. Jean played the translated log. He showed the schematics of Project Gentle Garden. The reaction was not cries of panic. It was a deep, cold stillness that filled the crowded room. Faces hardened. Eyes that had been tired now burned with a sharp, clear light. Sumin, the nurse, was the first to speak. "So it was murder. A slow, quiet murder. What do? We answer," said Tay, his voice low and steady. How? Asked an older man. We have no army. Nos jeeps. We live in holes. Jean stood up. They think we are dead. They think they were gardeners pulling weeds. They never expected the weeds to look back. He pointed to the data crystal. This is not just a record of what they did. It is a key. It has schematics, science. It shows us how they think. We do not build what they build. We build what they fear. A plan began not from one leader but from the whole group. It was a silent agreement. They would become something else. They would become a secret. The first step was moving. The Busan Haven was compromised. They used the alien device to find other, deeper places. Old missile silos from forgotten wars. Deep-sea mining stations that had been sealed shut. Vast cave systems under mountains. Survivors from other groups, contacted by risky radio messages with coded phrases, were brought in. The message was simple. We found the reason. The fight is not over. Come and build. Jin's engineers, with Day's help, took apart the crashed ship in Siberia piece by piece. They did not try to fly it. They studied its material, a metal that was light as plastic and stronger than steel. They learned to make a simpler version using the broken world's resources. They learned how its cloaking system worked, not to hide a ship, but to hide a factory. They built their forges deep under the Rocky Mountains, where the Earth's heat gave them power. The air was hot and filled with the smell of molten rock and hard work. No one complained. Mira and her biologists took a different path. They studied the strange, colorful fluids from the alien ship. They found the nanites, tiny machines now dead. Using old medical lab equipment, they started to create their own. Not to change the weather, but to target specific alien life patterns they found in the data. They made a tool to break a world, Mira said, her hands steady inside a safety glove box. We will make a key that fits only their lock. Tay was the organizer. He became the heart of a new, silent network. He managed the movement of materials. Food from hidden algae farms was sent to the miners. Metal from ruined cities was sent to the forges. He found people with old skills. Chemists, programmers, welders, teachers. Every person had a job. Every scrap had a use. Children learned math and xenobiology from salvaged screens. They were not just surviving anymore. They were students of vengeance. Years passed. The people changed. They spoke less. They moved with purpose. The shared truth bonded them like a cold fire. They called their project Jurimja, which meant shadow. They were the shadow of a dead Earth growing longer and sharper. Their first great success was not a weapon, but a shield. Using the alien principles, they created a quantum cloak. It could hide a large area from scanners, making it look like empty rock or space. They cloaked their main shipyard in a deep crater on the dark side of the moon. Here, in silent, airless secrecy, they built their fleet. The ships were not like the alien teardrop. They were angular and plain like sharp stones. They had no crews. They were drones, controlled from hidden bases on Earth. They were packed with Myra's bio-targeted agents and Jin's simple, brutal weapons. One weapon used gravity fields like a sculptor's hammer to crush and twist. Another, the thread cutter, sent a pulse that unraveled certain molecular bonds in the alien ship hulls. They were tools for a specific, cruel job. One evening, Jean and Mira stood on a hidden platform overlooking the lunar shipyard. Below them, in the stark shadows, hundreds of gray, angular ships sat in silent rows. The blue marble of Earth hung in the black sky, still scarred, still silent. It is terrible, what we have made, Mira said softly. Yes, Jean agreed, his eyes on the ships. It is a mirror. They gave us a terrible thing. We learned its shape. Now we give it back. Will it bring our world back? Our parents? The children who starved? No, Jean said. His face was lined, older than his years. Nothing will. This is not for them. This is for the next children. So that no gardener will ever look at their cradle and think it is a gentle thing to pull them out by the roots. He took her hand. They stood together in the great, soundless dark, looking at their terrible creation and the wounded world it was meant to avenge. They felt no joy, only the weight of a debt about to be paid in full. The day the galaxy changed began like any other for the Galactic Coalition. On the shining world of Illyria 4, the conclave of sustained harmony was in full bloom. Representatives from 100 species moved through towers of crystal and light. They discussed trade routes and energy quotas. They enjoyed foods from 1,000 worlds. Peace, enforced and orderly, was a fact of life. The Triarch species, the Veil, the Krell, the Synax, hosted the event. They were the architects of this peace. They felt wise and secure. In a quiet hall, the Triarchs presented a minor award. It was for efficient resource reclamation. The recipient was the project manager of a long-completed operation, Project Gentle Garden. He was a Veil named Lore. He accepted the small crystal sphere, a symbol of a job well done. He did not think of Subject 8897. That file was closed. The planet was quiet. The resources would be collected soon, now that the native species was no longer an obstacle. It was all very clean. Far above Illyria 4, in the void, the first sign was a flicker. A small asteroid, one of millions in the system's belt, simply vanished from sensor scans for a fraction of a second. No one noticed. Then another did the same. And another, like a field of grass bending before an unseen wind. Deep in a bunker under the Ural Mountains, Gene sat in a simple chair. Before him was a screen showing the glittering jewel of Illyria, 4 from 100 different angles. Data streams flowed. Mira stood beside him, her hand on the back of his chair. Tay was at a separate station, his voice calm as he spoke into a headset, coordinating the final checks. The room was cool, quiet, and tense. All Jorimja units are in position, Tay said. The fractal noise satellites are active. Coalition sensor density is high, but their pattern recognition is looking for threats of a certain size and signature. They are blind to the dust. Jean nodded. Begin the dispersal. In space around the beautiful planet, the asteroids that were not asteroids cracked open. From each one, 10 or 20 small gray shapes emerged. They were the human vessels. They were no bigger than a ground transport. They had no bright engines, only short, precise thrusters that glowed a dim blue. They moved like drifting seeds, spreading out in a vast, invisible net around the world on Illyria 4. In the Grand Amphitheater, Lore the Veil was giving a short speech about prudent management. The sky was a soothing pink. Then, the lights in the crystal towers flickered. A low hum, felt more than heard, vibrated through the air. A Krell ambassador looked up, annoyed. A power surge, perhaps. Above the city, the air began to shimmer. It was like a heat haze, but it grew fast, covering the sky. It was the combined quantum cloak of thousands of human drones disengaging at once. The sky turned a dull, matte gray, and then it was full of silent, angular shapes, blotting out the sun. Panic did not start immediately. There was confusion. What were these objects? A new Triarch display? But the Triarchs were also looking up, their large eyes wide with confusion. The human drones did not fire lasers or missiles. They released canisters. The canisters burst open high in the atmosphere, releasing clouds of fine, golden dust. Myra's bio-targeted agents. The dust drifted down on the gentle breezes, entering environmental systems, settling on skin and clothing. It was keyed to the specific genetic and neurological markers of the 3 Triarch species. Lore stopped speaking. He felt a sudden, heavy tiredness. His limbs became like stone. Around him, Veil, Krell, and Synax ambassadors began to slump in their seats, their eyes glazing over. They fell into a deep, living stasis. Their hearts beat slowly. They breathed, but they could not move, could not speak. A Krell guard stumbled, his weapon clattering to the floor as he fell into a still, silent sleep. The other species, the delegates from worlds not part of the old atrocity, cried out in alarm. They shook their Triarch neighbors, but got no response. They were unharmed. The golden dust did nothing to them. The message was clear. This was not an attack on the galaxy. This was for the Triarchs alone. Then the ground shook. Not a violent quake, but a deep, rolling groan. At the edges of the glittering city, where the great towers met the ground, the foundation stones began to change. They rippled like liquid and then turned to slurry. The human gravity shear weapons were working at a molecular level, liquefying the bedrock. The towers did not explode. They sank, gracefully and terribly, like ships going down in calm water. The sound was a vast, grinding sigh. High above, the Triarch Defense Fleet, stationed at the system's edge, finally detected the anomaly. Ships turned, weapons powered. But as they did, their sensors were flooded with nonsense. A screaming fractal noise of false signals, ghost images, and scrambled coordinates broadcast from millions of tiny satellites. To the fleet commanders, their screens showed 100 invading armadas, 1,000 weapon signatures. It was all fake. They were blinded, shouting over each other, unable to see the simple, terrible truth happening on the planet below. I in the bunker. Jean watched the main screen. It showed a feed from a drone hovering above the amphitheater. He saw the still, paralyzed forms of the Triarchs. He saw the other species looking around in terrified confusion. He saw his own gray drones hanging in the silent sky like knives. Myra's breath was slow. The stasis field is stable. No collateral casualties reported. Tay looked up. The coalition fleet is neutralized. They are fighting ghosts. Jean leaned forward. He pressed a button. On Illyria 4, a single human drone detached from the swarm. It moved slowly, deliberately, down through the hazy air. It came to a stop, hovering right above the silent, paralyzed Triarch leaders. Its rough, angular shape was a stark shadow against the pink sky. A light on its side glowed. A calm, clear voice issued from it, speaking in perfect coalition standard. It was Jin's voice, translated by the systems they had stolen and mastered. We are humanity. You called us Subject 8897. You practiced your gardening on our world. The voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was as calm and cold as deep space. And in the terrible, sinking silence of the wounded world, every being could hear it perfectly. Jin's voice filled the air over the amphitheater. It was flat. It held no emotion. It was just facts, spoken into the silence of the sinking city. 53 years ago, you began Project Gentle Garden. You used orbital mechanics to break our crust. You seeded our sky with machines to poison our land. You watched as billions died. You called it efficient. You called it pacification. On the screen in the bunker, he could see the faces of the other alien species. Their confusion was turning into something else. They were listening. They were hearing the story of a crime they never knew about. You believed we were too primitive to notice. You believed we would blame ourselves. You believed we would die quietly. A pause. You were wrong. The hovering drone projected a light. In the air above the paralyzed Triarchs, a moving image appeared. It showed the schematics of Earth with the target zones glowing. It showed the clinical logs from the crashed scout ship. Then it changed. It showed human faces from before the silencing. People laughing, children playing. Then it showed the after. The ruins. The empty eyes of the starving. The silent graves. The contrast was brutal. This is what your gentle gardening grew, Jin's voice said in the bunker. Mira had her eyes closed. She remembered the faces in the pictures. Some of them were people she knew. Tay watched the screen, his jaw a hard line. This was the reason for all the years in the dark, all the hard work. To make them see. The images faded. The drone's light focused on the still form of Lord the Vale, his award crystal still clutched in his stiff hand. Now you will listen to our terms, Jean said. They are not negotiable. He began to list them. The complete and public abdication of the Triarch species from the ruling Coalition Council. The immediate surrender of all Triarch military assets to a neutral galactic authority. The full, open confession of Project Gentle Garden to every species in the galaxy. And the final term, the total and immediate restoration of Earth's biosphere. The Triarchs would provide the technology, the resources, the energy. They would repair what they broke. A murmur went through the unharmed ambassadors. The terms were absolute. They were a complete unmasking and unmaking of galactic power. You have 1 hour to signal your compliance, Jin's voice continued. Your leaders here will be kept in stasis. They can hear us. They understand. To show our resolve, we will demonstrate the consequence of refusal. On the screen, the view switched. It pulled back from Illyria for showing the planet and its 2 small barren moons. One of the moons, a gray rock called Illyria for B, was highlighted. A section of the human drone swarm broke away. 100 of the angular ships moved toward the moon. They surrounded it in a loose ring. They did not fire. Instead, they pulsed. A deep, purple light connected them, forming a net around the moon. This is a molecular destabilizer, Jin explained, his tone still like a teacher's. It does not explode. It persuades matter to forget how to hold together. The purple light intensified. The moon's surface began to change. It did not crack or shatter. The gray rock turned to a fine, dark sand. The process started at one point and spread, slow and steady like a stain. A huge cloud of dust silently rose into the airless space as the moon began to disintegrate from the outside in. It was not fast. It would take the full hour to complete. It was a visible, horrifying clock on Illyria. 4. The watching species saw the moon begin to turn to dust on their pink horizon. A collective sound of dread filled the air. The message was clear. This is not a weapon of war. This is a tool of erasure. Your choice is simple, Jin said. Comply and your people live. Your civilization will be judged, but it will continue. Refuse and we will apply this tool to every Triarch world, one by one. We will unmake your history, your art, your cities. We will leave only dust and silence, just as you tried to leave us. He let the silence hang. The only sound was the low hum of the drone above the amphitheater and the distant, terrified whispers of the crowd. Then, a new voice crackled. It was weak, strained. It came from the communication system of the paralyzed lore. His lips did not move, but a device in his ceremonial robe was emitting a signal. The stasis field allowed for minimal, sluggish brain activity. He was using a neural link. The voice was slurred, thick with fear and effort. You are monsters. The voice of lore whispered to the galaxy. For the first time, emotion entered Jin's transmitted voice. It was not anger. It was a weary, icy pity. No, he said. We are gardeners. You planted a seed of ash and grief in our soil. You taught us how it grows. This, he said, as the moon continued to silently crumble behind him, this is your harvest. He cut the transmission in the bunker. The screen showed the crumbling moon and the silent, sinking city. The room was very quiet. Will they agree? Mira asked, her voice small. It does not matter, Jin said, his eyes on the disintegrating rock. If they say no, we will do it. We will erase them. And if they say yes, they will live with the shame forever. They will have to fix the world they broke and look every day at what they did. Both are a kind of vengeance. He leaned back. The fire that had driven him for decades was still there, but it had burned down to coals. It gave no warmth. It only waited to consume what was offered on the screens. The slow, silent unraveling of the moon continued. A perfect clock counting down the last minutes of the old galaxy's peace. The silence that followed Jin's words was total. On Illyria 4, the only sounds were the soft, panicked breaths of the unharmed ambassadors and the deep, groaning sigh of the city as it continued its slow, graceful sink into the ground. The paralyzed Triarchs lay still, their eyes open and unseeing, prisoners in their own bodies. In the command bunker under the Urals, the humans watched their screens. The image of the crumbling moon, Illyria 4b, was split with views of the coalition fleet. The fleet was a chaos of light and movement, but it was going nowhere. Ships turned in circles, firing at phantom signals on their screens. The fractal noise was a perfect cage. The mighty Triarch armada was helpless, blinded by a storm of lies. The hour ticked down. 40 minutes remained. The moon was now a deformed ball. A quarter of it already turned to a spreading cloud of fine, dark powder that hung in space like a funeral shroud. Then, a signal came. It was not from the Triarch fleet. It was from a different source. A ship from a neutral species, the Fel, had been observing from a safe distance. Their ambassador on the surface, unharmed by the golden dust, had managed to get a clear signal out. The face of the Fel ambassador appeared on a secondary screen. Her skin was a soft green, her eyes large and dark with distress. "Humanity," she said, her voice translated by the system. "This is Ambassador Nia of the Fel hegemony. We have heard your evidence. We did not know." She looked genuinely shaken. "We are transmitting the data packet of Project Gentle Garden to every public and private network in the galaxy. The truth is now visible to all." A new window opened on the main screen. It showed the galactic information streams. The quiet, clinical logs of the project, the maps of Earth, the casualty estimates. All of it was spreading like a virus through 1,000 different communication systems. The story of the quiet genocide was no longer a secret. The reaction was not instantaneous anger at humanity. It was a wave of revulsion, horror, and betrayal directed at the Triarchs. The galaxy had believed in the Coalition's peace. Now they saw the rotten foundation it was built upon. With 20 minutes left on the clock, the second signal arrived. It was from the command ship of the Coalition fleet itself. The acting commander was a Krell, but not of the ruling lineage. His face was on the screen, his expression one of grim defeat. The noise blockade was still in place, but Jin's people allowed this one clean signal through. "Human forces," the commander said, his voice heavy. "The Triarch High Command is incapacitated. As the senior officer of the combined fleet who is not of the ruling lineages, I am issuing a stand-down order to all vessels. We will power down offensive systems. We acknowledge the terms." He swallowed a hard motion. "The Triarch governments on the homeworlds are in chaos. They are signaling their surrender. They will submit to a neutral tribunal. They will provide what is needed for Earth." He was not agreeing out of nobility. He was agreeing because he could see the moon turning to dust. He was agreeing because his own crew, many of whom were not Triarchs, were looking at him with new, accusing eyes. The moral and military ground had vanished beneath him. "That I in the bunker." Tay let out a long, slow breath. Mira put a hand over her mouth. They had won. Without firing a single explosive shot at a living ship, they had won. Jean stared at the commander's face. He felt nothing. No triumph. No relief. Just a hollow, cold space where his rage had been. "Confirm the surrender with a full, open transmission from the Triarch homeworlds," Jean said, his voice still that same flat, calm instrument. "The moment we verify it, we will halt the destabilization of the moon. The stasis field on your leaders will remain until the first reparations ships enter Earth's orbit." The commander nodded, a quick, jerky motion of shame. "It will be done." The signal from the Triarch homeworlds came 12 minutes later. It was a ragged, broken thing. The voices of the substitute leaders were filled with a terror they had never known. They read the terms of surrender. They confessed to Project Gentle Garden. They ordered all Triarch forces to stand down. They pledged the full resources of their worlds to the restoration of Earth. Jean gave a single, small nod to Tay. Tay spoke into his headset. "Jurimja units. Cease the destabilization pulse. Hold all other positions." On the screen, the purple net of light around the moon flickered and died. The process of unraveling stopped. Less than half of Illyria, 4B, remained. The rest was a permanent, expanding ring of dust around the planet, a monument to what had happened here. The human drones around Illyria 4 did not celebrate. They simply held their positions, silent and watchful. The golden dust began to settle. The stasis field would remain active, a guarantee. Across the galaxy, the silence returned. But it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a child who has just seen a parent do a cruel thing. It was the silence of shattered trust. The glittering image of the Coalition was broken. And in its place, standing amid the ruins they did not create, was humanity. Not as victims pleading for justice, but as cold, precise, and utterly terrifying arbiters of it. Jean switched off his microphone. The quiet in the bunker was thick. "It is over," Mira whispered. For them, Jean said, looking at the image of Earth now replacing the battle scenes on the main screen. It was still scarred, still sick. For us, it is just beginning. Now we have to go home and see if a garden can really grow from all this ash. 5 years later, the sky over the Korean peninsula was blue. It was not the harsh, acid-washed blue from before, nor the muddy gray of the silencing. It was a soft, new blue, clean. The air smelled of damp soil and young leaves, not of dust and decay. Jean stood on a grassy hill overlooking the sea. Below, where the ruins of Busan had been, was now a basin of vibrant green. Fast-growing, engineered forests spread out, their roots binding the soil. In the distance, great, graceful machines of alien design hovered silently. They were atmospheric processors, sent by the Triarchs as part of the reparations. They scrubbed the toxins, balanced the gases, and guided the weather back into gentle, life-giving patterns. It was working. The planet was healing. But it was a hospital, not yet a home. Mira walked up the hill to stand beside him. Her hair, now streaked with more gray, blew in the warm breeze. She carried a small tablet showing genetic recovery rates for coastal plankton. Progress in cold numbers. The latest report from the equatorial zone is good, she said. The rainforests are starting to generate their own microclimate again. In a century, they might be self-sustaining. Jean nodded, his eyes on the horizon. A century, he repeated quietly. They had one. The Triarch species lived, but they were broken. Their governments were dissolved, their military power given over to a new galactic council. Their history was now a footnote of shame. Every year they sent resources and technology to Earth. They worked under human supervision, rebuilding the world they had tried to erase. It was the most profound punishment imaginable. To be forced to fix, forever reminded of what they had broken. Humanity was not celebrated in the galaxy. They were respected, with a respect that was 1 part awe and 2 parts fear. They were called the Reckoners. Their cold, precise vengeance at Illyria, for was a story told in whispers. No one threatened them. No one offered friendship. They were left alone, a quiet, formidable presence in a corner of space. Tay came up the hill, his steps slower now. He managed the distribution of alien technology and resources. He was fair, but he was not forgiving. The Triarch engineers spoke to him with bowed heads. The oceanic pH is almost normalized, Tay said, joining them. The new coral larvae are taking hold off Jeju. My grandson saw a fish today he didn't have a name for. He just called it pretty. A small, real smile touched Myra's lips. It was a rare thing. They stood in silence, the 3 of them, looking at the new world. They had everything they had fought for. Peace, security, a future. Yet, a heaviness remained. A shared weight they carried in their bones. Jean thought of the silent drone swarm over Illyria, for he thought of the moon dissolving into nothing. He thought of the paralyzed, terrified faces of the Triarchs. He had done those things. He had become a monster to destroy other monsters. The righteousness of his cause did not wash the deeds from his hands. He saw them in his dreams, not as victories, but as surgeries he had performed on the galaxy, cold and bloody. Do you think they will ever understand? Mira asked, her voice soft. The next generation. Will they understand why we had to be so brutal? No, Jean said, and I hope they don't. To understand it, they would have had to live through the silence we lived through. I hope they only know the blue sky and the pretty fish. I hope our story becomes a strange, dark legend to them. He turned from the view of the rebuilding world and looked at his old friends. Their faces were lined with the memories of the long darkness and the hard choices made in the shadow. We remembered, Jean said, more to himself than to them. When everyone else forgot we existed, we remembered. And we made sure they would remember, too. Yes, Mira said, taking his hand. Her grip was strong. And so will they. Forever. That was the true victory, and its true cost. The galaxy's silence after Illyria 4 was not just shock. It was a permanent, ingrained caution. Humanity had not just avenged itself, it had rewritten the rules. They had proven that even the smallest, most broken seed, buried in ash, could grow into something that could shake the stars. The sun began to set over the new sea. The processors in the sky caught the light, painting streaks of gentle orange and pink. It was a beautiful sunset, artificial, guided, and paid for in blood and terror, but beautiful nonetheless. Down in the green basin, children's laughter echoed, a sound once thought lost forever. Gene listened to it. He felt the warmth of Myra's hand in his. He saw the determined set of Tay's shoulders beside him. They had given the children a sky. They had given them a future. And they had borne the weight of becoming the ghosts in the galaxy's machine so that those children would never have to. The last light faded. In the great, wide galaxy, the story was filed away under the human correction. And the quiet that settled over Earth that evening was not the silence of death, but the profound, echoing silence of a debt finally paid.